The old man had been sitting by the dock for the better part of an hour before anyone thought to introduce him. He had a Tim Hortons cup balanced on the arm of his folding chair. Double, gone cold, and he was watching the St. Lawrence move the way people watch rivers when they're not really watching the river at all. Someone had set up a Canada Day gathering in Denny Fontaine's backyard on Rue des Érables in Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue, paper plates and lawn chairs and a cooler full of Molson Canadian, and he had arrived quietly with his daughter Suzanne and her husband Paul, and then Suzanne had been absorbed into the party the way hostesses' daughters always are, and the old man had found his chair near the dock and sat down in it with the careful deliberateness of a man who has chosen his position and intends to hold it. His name was Fernand Gagnon, and he was 76 years old, and nobody at this party knew anything about him, which suited him very well. If you believe that the men who carry the weight of this country deserve to have someone carry it with them, type honor in the comments below. He wore pressed khaki trousers and a plain blue short-sleeve shirt, the kind of shirt that costs nothing and says nothing and draws no attention to the man wearing it. He had a full head of white hair, cut short enough that it still looked military if you knew what military hair looked like. His hands rested on his knees with the particular stillness of hands that have learned not to move without reason. His face was deeply weathered in the specific way of men who have spent years outdoors in conditions that were not recreational. The creases running deep around his eyes, a whitened scar along the left forearm that he never explained, a quality in the jaw that suggested it had been set in a certain expression for so long that it had simply forgotten how to arrange itself differently. He walked with a slight favouring of his left side that was not quite a limp and not quite not one. His right hip had been replaced at the Montreal General in 2019, and before that it had been managed with anti-inflammatories and stubbornness for approximately 11 years. He didn't mention the hip. He had stopped mentioning it sometime around 2015. Suzanne had introduced him to the couple nearest the dock, Nathalie and Robert Clattier, who had moved to Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue from Brossard 3 years ago and were still learning the neighbourhood. Robert worked in commercial real estate. Nathalie taught at the Cégep. They were pleasant people with nothing particular to say to a 76-year-old man they'd never met, and he asked them a few polite questions about the neighbourhood and listened to their answers. And then the conversation reached its natural end, and Robert got up to find another beer, and Nathalie joined a group of women near the picnic table, and Fernand Gagnon sat alone by the dock and watched the river. He noticed the loud man almost immediately, not because he was alarming, because he was loud, not in the way of someone raising their voice, but in the way of someone whose presence spreads outward from them like sound from a speaker, occupying more of the air than their physical body requires, expanding into whatever space is available, making the air around them slightly warmer and slightly less quiet. He was maybe 50 thick through the shoulders, with the beginning of a belly that came after the muscle left. He wore a red polo shirt and new white sneakers, and he had the kind of laugh that announces itself 3 seconds before it arrives. His name, Fernand would learn later, was Stefan Auger. He sold equipment to municipal waterworks departments, and he had been the most interesting person at every party he'd ever attended, at least according to Stefan Auger. He was holding court near the fire pit with 4 or 5 people around him, gesturing with his beer in the way of a man who has learned that gestures make stories more convincing. Fernand caught fragments across the yard. 37 of us holding a ridge for 5 days without resupply. I'm telling you, it changed me. You never forget that kind of thing. He noted the polo shirt. He noted the new sneakers. He noted the cadence of the story, which had the particular smoothness of something told many times, the edges worn down by repetition until it moved like something that had always been true. He went back to his Tim Hortons cup. Something in him, some old calibration he had spent decades trying to turn down, never quite succeeding, had begun to register an error. Not a specific error yet, just a frequency, a wrong note, the way a word in the wrong language will drop into a sentence that is otherwise correct and sit there demanding attention before the conscious mind has caught up to it. He waited. He was extraordinarily patient. He had learned patience in terrain where impatience killed people. And then Stefan Auger said the word Medak, and Fernand Gagnon's cold coffee cup stopped moving toward his mouth. He set it down on the arm of his chair. He looked at Nathalie Cloutier, who had drifted back beside him. He said, very quietly, "Excuse me a moment." He stood up, What nobody at Denis Fontaine's Canada Day gathering could have anticipated was what Fernand Gagnon was going to do when he got there. He didn't move quickly. He had no urgency in him that anyone could see. He moved at the pace of a man with a replaced hip and a cold coffee and nowhere pressing to be, which was, if you knew how to read it, the same pace at which he had moved through many other spaces in his life. Purpose disguised as patience. Patience that concealed a great deal. Stefan was mid-sentence when Fernand arrived at the edge of the circle. The Croats side us pinned the eastern flank for almost 6 hours and the UN observers wouldn't even— "Which sector?" Fernand said. He said it the way you correct a wrong turn on a map. Not unkindly, just precisely. The circle opened for him the way circles open for old men at parties automatically, without anyone deciding to. Stefan looked at him. Fernand looked at Stefan. There was a moment of the particular measuring that has nothing to do with size. "Fernand," he said, "Suzanne's father." Stefan. The handshake was firm, the grip of a man who has read somewhere that firm handshakes communicate confidence. "Stefan Auger, you were talking about the Medak Pocket." He was. Stefan's chin lifted slightly. Not defensive, not yet. Served there, September 93. 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's. Fernand nodded. He looked at Stefan the way a man looks when he is about to ask a question he already knows the answer to. "Which sector?" he said again. Stefan smiled. It was a practiced smile, comfortable and expansive, the smile of a man who has never been asked a question he couldn't answer. "Eastern edge of the pocket. We were pushing through the villages toward the Croatian positions." "Which village?" "There were several villages." "You know how it was over there." "I do," Fernand said. "Which one were you in when the ceasefire broke down on the 15th? Something moved behind Stefan's eyes. Not alarm yet. The recalibration of a man who expected a different kind of conversation. It was a confusing time. Things were fluid. They were, Fernand agreed. He looked out at the river. The Croats had already begun destroying the villages before the ceasefire took effect. There was evidence of what they'd done. Our people were first in. The smell stayed in your clothes for a week. He turned back to Stefan. "What do you remember about the smell?" The circle had changed. Not dramatically, not with people rushing in, but with the quiet gravitational shift that occurs when a conversation becomes more serious than the surrounding party and people near it find reasons to stop moving. Stefan said, "There were bodies. Everyone who was there remembers the bodies." "There were," Fernand said. "What else?" "It was war. You remember certain things and certain things you don't." "That's true," Fernand said. He said it as though agreeing with himself about something. The livestock, for instance, they killed the animals too, that particular smell on top of everything else in September heat. He let a beat pass. It doesn't leave you. Something had gone slightly careful in Stefan's face. The ease was still there, but it was being maintained now rather than natural. Fernand watched this with the patience of a man who has tracked movement through much less visible terrain. "Tell me about the handover," Fernand said. "The handover?" "When our people moved into the vacated Croatian positions, there was a specific protocol. The ceasefire terms had to be documented. The CF officers on site were recording everything. You would have been part of that." Stefan took a drink of his beer. "I was a private. Privates don't get briefed on the full picture." "No," Fernand agreed. "But they see things. That's what I mean. The actual things at ground level. The houses, the personal items left behind, what the villages looked like from inside." He tilted his head slightly. "What did they look like? Inside?" The small crowd had rearranged itself without anyone managing it. Denis Fontaine had come over from the grill. A man named Claude Beaulieu, who had driven up from Vaudreuil for the weekend, had set down his paper plate. A young woman who'd been sitting with her boyfriend on the dock steps had stood up without explaining why. Stefan said, "You're asking me to remember specific details from 30 years ago." "I remember specific details from 30 years ago," Fernand said pleasantly. "I think about them often. I find I always will. We all process things differently." "We do," Fernand said. He nodded, looking at the dock, at the river, at the particular quality of July light on the water. "Tell me about the citation." "What citation?" PCLI was awarded the Commander-in-Chief Unit Commendation for Medak. First time a Canadian unit received one in 50 years. He looked at Stefan. "Do you remember the ceremony?" Stefan's jaw tightened once. "I was out of the forces by then." "It was 1995, Fernand said. "You would have been out quickly. Things happen. People leave. They do." Fernand looked at him steadily. "Which platoon?" Stefan stopped, restarted. I was attached to different elements. It was fluid, like I said. It was, Fernand said. I know how fluid it was. He said it quietly, and something in the way he said it made 3 people in the circle look at him at the same moment. Something in the texture of the sentence, the absence of performance in it, the weight of a man who is not explaining himself but simply stating a fact about his own life, the way you state your own name. Denis Fontaine, who had known Fernand's daughter Suzanne since primary school, and had therefore met Fernand Gagnon perhaps 4 or 5 times over 20 years of neighbourhood events, found himself looking at the old man by the dock with a new quality of attention. There was something in the stillness of him, not the stillness of a man at a party, a different kind. Stephen said, "Look, I'm not going to sit here and have every detail of a 30-year-old deployment cross-examined by—" "I haven't cross-examined anything," Fernand said. He said it without heat. "I've asked you what the villages smelled like. I've asked you which platoon. I've asked you what you remember from inside the houses." He paused. "These are not difficult questions for a man who was there. What nobody in that backyard yet understood, not Denis, not Stephen, not the young woman by the dock steps, was why Fernand Gagnon had crossed the yard in the first place. It wasn't anger. Fernand Gagnon had not been an angry man in a very long time. Anger required a kind of energy that he had long since redirected into things that were more useful. What he was, if you had the vocabulary for it, was specific, the opposite of general. The opposite of a man who could hear the word Medak spoken at a summer party by a man in new white sneakers and let it slide past him, the way all the other words at the party slid past him, because this word was not like the other words, because this word had a weight that it had not earned in Stefan Aga's mouth and had therefore taken without permission from the people who had actually paid for it. Fernand Gagnon had arrived in Croatia in late August of 1993 as a warrant officer with the Lord Strathcona's horse, attached to the multinational force operating in the Krajina region under UNPROFOR command. He was 47 years old at the time. He had been in the Canadian forces for 26 years. He did not talk about what he had seen in the Medak Pocket, not at family dinners, not at the Legion on Remembrance Day, not in any conversation he had willingly entered since his return. He had read the articles, in later years, when the story finally became public, when journalists began to reconstruct what had actually happened in those villages in September 1993. When it became possible to say out loud that Canadian soldiers had witnessed evidence of massacres and had documented it and had held their lines and done their duty in conditions of profound and deliberate horror. He had read those articles in his kitchen in the house on Rue Principale in Saint-Lazare, where he had lived alone since his wife Monique had died in 2017, and he had read them as a man reads a document about events he was present for, not to learn what happened but to see whether the record was accurate. He had served alongside 3 men in that pocket who had not come home the same. One had never spoken about it in the 30 years since, and had died of a heart attack in Petawawa in 2018. One had gone through the Vita process and eventually, carefully, found a way through. One had not found a way through, and Fernand knew where he was buried, because he had been there when they put him in the ground. In a military cemetery outside of Kingston on a Tuesday in November, with cold rain coming sideways off the lake and a flag folded with the particular precision of men who are trying to make something permanent out of something irreversible. He had carried these men the way he carried most things, without demonstration, without request, without the particular performance of suffering that would have made other people more comfortable. He was not interested in making other people comfortable. He was interested in accuracy, in the names being attached to the correct history, in the weight being carried by the people who had actually picked it up, and not borrowed by people who had merely heard about it and found it useful. What he could not sit in a lawn chair and let pass was a man in a red polo shirt borrowing that weight at a summer party. He finished his cold coffee. He set the cup on the arm of the chair. He thought about the 3 men, their faces in the August light of the Krajina region, the red clay dust on everything, the particular silence after the Croat positions were vacated, before the full picture of what had been done in those villages became clear. He stood up and walked across Denis Fontaine's yard. He arrived back in the conversation to find that Stefan had shored himself up during the 30 seconds. Fernand had looked at the river. He was talking again, the velocity back, the gesture returning to the story. Recovering the way, performers recover by moving forward fast enough that the stumble becomes part of the act. What you have to understand is that our ROE were a disaster. We were watching atrocities happen, and the chain of command wouldn't authorize us to intervene. And as a soldier, you carry that forever. Fernan stood at the edge of the circle and listened. He let it run. He noted the parts that were accurate. The ROE situation was real, was documented, was one of the most painful parts of what had happened there. He noted the way Stefan had absorbed that accurate detail and draped it over his false story like a tarp, using the truth as a frame for the performance. He noted the absence of the specific, no unit positions, no village names, no sounds, no smells, no texture, just the grand shape of suffering, borrowed and worn like a coat that had been cut for someone else. And then Stefan said, "I watched a good man die that day. A friend of mine. You don't come back from that." He said it with quiet gravity, the kind of gravity that closes rooms, the kind that makes it indecent to ask questions. Fernand looked at him. "What was his name?" he said. The July afternoon continued around them. Somewhere behind the garage, someone was setting off the first of the Canada Day fireworks. The river kept moving in its indifferent way. The smell of charcoal and bug spray and cut grass, the ordinary smell of summer in Quebec. But in this circle, in this 10-foot radius, something had gone absolutely still. Stefan looked at Fernand. His glass was in his hand. He hadn't drunk from it in some time. "It was a long time ago," he said. "You just said you carry it forever," Fernand said. "Not unkindly. Precisely. The name of a man you watched die is not something that becomes a long time ago." Stefan's mouth opened slightly, closed. The practiced ease was entirely gone now. What was in its place was the specific expression of a man who has told a story at enough parties that he believed it had become real, and who is only now, in this moment, confronted with the fact that it has not. "I'm not going to." "His name," Fernand said. He wasn't looking at Stefan with contempt. He was looking at him with the flat, patient attention of a man who has a specific task and intends to complete it. "That's all I'm asking." The circle was quiet. Denny Fontaine was watching with an expression that moved between discomfort and something harder to name. The young woman from the dock steps had her arms crossed and was very still. Claude Beaulieu, the man from Vaudreuil, had the look of someone who has just realized he is present at something he will be trying to describe accurately to other people for the rest of his life. Stefan said nothing. The nothing was very loud. Fernand took one breath. He looked out at the river, and then he looked back at the circle, not at Stefan, at everyone, and he said, "Then, let me tell you about some names." What happened next on Rue des Érables would be described imperfectly and in pieces in the conversations of Denny Fontaine's neighbours for the rest of that summer. "Private First Class Antoine Desrosiers," Fernand said. He said it the way you say something that has been waiting to be said for a long time, not loudly, with the weight of what it actually was. 22 years old, from Jonquière. Died of injuries sustained in the Kraje region October 4, 1993, following an engagement with Croatian forces in which he held a position for 4 hours after being wounded in order to keep an evacuation corridor open for 2 injured colleagues. Nobody made a sound. Corporal Jean-Michel Tremblay, 26, from Rimouski, returned from deployment with injuries that were classified as non-combat at the time for reasons that had more to do with politics than medicine. He lived with those injuries for 9 years. He died in Kingston in November of 2002. I was at his funeral. I have been to his grave 12 times. Stefan Ogger had gone entirely still. His beer can was on the table beside him. He had not reached for it. "Master Corporal Medak Pocket," Fernand continued. His voice did not change in register or in pace. This was not performance. This was accounting, the kind of accounting that has to be done out loud because the record requires it. 31 years old, from Drummondville. He was with me when we entered the second village. What we found in that village I will not describe at a summer party, but Medak Pocket was the one who made sure it was documented, every piece of it, because he understood that documentation was the only weapon we had left by that point. He submitted 17 pages of written testimony to the Board of Inquiry. He never discussed it again. Fernand paused. He never had to. He had done what was required. The fireworks had stopped. Someone had turned off the music. Fernand did not appear to notice. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man looking at something that is not in the yard. "Those men were there," he said. "They carried what was in those villages. They never borrowed what they hadn't earned. They never stood at a party in a polo shirt and used the weight of it to make themselves more interesting. He looked at Stefan. He looked at him without hatred, simply with the complete clarity of a man who has decided to say a true thing. I don't know what you were doing in September of 1993. I don't know where you actually were, but I know you were not there, because I was there, and the men I've named were there, and I know every face that came through that pocket with me, and yours is not one of them. The silence on Rue des Érables was the kind that arrives rarely, the silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too large for sound to run alongside. And then a voice came from behind the group. It belonged to a man named Medak Pocket, who had arrived 15 minutes ago and set a bowl of homemade coleslaw on the food table and then gone looking for Dennis to say hello. He was 68 years old, compact and white-haired, wearing a plain grey t-shirt. He had lived 4 houses down from the Fontaine property for 11 years. He had been to perhaps a dozen of Dennis's gatherings over that time. He brought coleslaw because his wife made it, and it was always well received. He had stopped at the edge of the circle and listened for the last 3 minutes without anyone noticing him arrive. "I was there," he said. He said it quietly, without drama, the way you state a fact that requires no support. The circle turned. Bernard Cote did not acknowledge the attention. He was looking at Fernand Gagnon. "2nd Battalion PPCLI," he said. "I was a platoon sergeant. We were the first unit into Chitluk after the Croats pulled back." He looked at Fernand for a moment. "Strathconers." It was not a question, a statement of recognition, the way two people who knew the same territory identify each other. Fernand looked at him. "Cote, you don't know me," Bernard said. "We didn't overlap directly, but I know who Warrant Officer Gagnon was. Everyone who was in the pocket knew the name. Your position held the northern flank for 31 hours during the ceasefire negotiations." He paused. 31 hours. Without confirmation that the ceasefire would hold. Several things happened in the faces of the people in the circle at once. Denis Fontaine's expression, which had been moving between unease and confusion for the last 10 minutes, resolved into something completely different. The young woman from the dock steps had her hand over her mouth. Claude Beaulieu, the man from Vaudry, had gone very still in the way of a man who is trying to make sure he will be able to remember this correctly. Bernard Cote was not finished. "My men talked about that northern position for years afterward," he said. "Not to the circle, to Fernand. When we were debriefing, when we were trying to make sense of what the 30 days in that pocket had actually been, the northern flank was the thing people kept coming back to, how it was held, why it was held the way it was." He stopped. "I have lived 4 houses from this man for 11 years, he said to the circle, "and I did not know." Fernand said nothing for a moment. He looked at Bernard Cote across the 8 feet between them, across 11 years of neighbourly ignorance, across 30 years, and the particular distance that lies between men who carry the same thing without knowing the other is carrying it. He said, "Cote." Bernard said, "I know the name Fernand Gagnon because after the deployment, when the inquiry was ongoing and the CF was trying very hard to keep what happened in Medak from becoming a public story, there was a document, an internal assessment of individual conduct during the ceasefire period. Your name was in it." He looked at the circle, at Stefan, at everyone. It was not a short assessment. Stefan Auger was looking at the ground. He had been looking at the ground for some time. His face had undergone a series of changes that left it, at this moment, looking simply like the face of a man who is 50 years old and has, for the first time in a very long time, been asked to account for himself in a way he was not prepared for. Not a villain, just a man who had borrowed something that wasn't his because the original owners were too quiet to object, and who had never until this afternoon been in the same space as someone who could state exactly what the cost of what he'd borrowed had actually been. Fernand looked at him one final time. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," he said. "You're old enough to know better, and you know that too." He kept his voice level, without contempt. "The men I named, Desrosiers, Tremblay, Paquette, they lived inside a history that can't be made entertaining at a summer party. That history is theirs, not ours to dress up in and wear around." He picked up his Tim Hortons cup. He looked at it, he set it down. "Happy Canada Day," he said. He turned and walked back to his chair by the dock. Behind him, the silence followed him the way his shad followed him, without being invited. Stefan Auger stood in the circle for approximately 1 minute. He looked at Bernard Cote. Bernard looked at him with the expression of a man who has been a sergeant and therefore knows exactly how to look at a situation without indicating what he intends to do about it. Stefan picked up his beer from the table. He looked at it, he set it back down. He walked to the side gate that opened onto the street and left without saying anything to anyone. His car, a black Ford Explorer, was gone from Rue des Érables within 3 minutes. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody said anything as he went. The silence he left behind was not hostile or triumphant. It was the silence of people who have been present for something they are still arranging into meaning. The way you arrange the pieces of something delicate after it has been dropped, carefully, making sure you have all of them before you decide what it was. Janet Morissette, who had taught high school history in Vaudreuil for 30 years and had been standing near the cooler when Fernan began naming the names, sat down in a folding chair and took a breath like someone surfacing. A young man named Mathieu Tremblay, no relation, had taken out his phone not to record but to search, and was now looking at his screen with an expression that moved from surprise to something quieter and more permanent. Bernard Cotet crossed the yard to the food table. He lifted the lid of his coleslaw. He checked it. He put the lid back. He picked up a plastic fork and sat down in the nearest lawn chair and looked at the St. Lawrence with the expression of a man who has just done something he didn't know he needed to do until he was already doing it. Denis Fontaine crossed the yard to the dock. Fernan was sitting in his chair. He had retrieved his empty Tim Hortons cup and was turning it in his hands in the absent way of a man who wants something to do with his hands and isn't particular about what. Denis sat down next to him. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I've known Suzanne for 30 years, he said finally. "I know I've met you at least a dozen times." "Yes." Denis looked at him. "I didn't know. I know," Fernan said. He set the cup on the arm of his chair. "Most people don't. That's generally how it should be." Denis was quiet. He looked at the river. "Is it?" Fernan considered this with genuine care. "The knowing isn't the point," he said. "Desrosiers knew. Tremblay knew. Paquette knew. That's enough people." He looked out at the water. "What bothers me is the not caring, and that man cared." He nodded in the direction Bernard Cotet was sitting. He cared about getting it right. That's rarer than people think. Suzanne appeared from across the yard. She had been watching from the edge of the group near the fire pit, had seen her father walk across the yard and stand in the circle, had watched the whole of it with the expression of a woman who loves her father and knows almost nothing about him, and is only now at 49 years old, beginning to understand the specific dimensions of what she doesn't know. She came to him directly, as she always did, and stood in front of his chair, and he looked up at her. And whatever she was about to say, she didn't say because her face was already saying it. He reached out and put his hand on hers for a moment. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not I know," he said. They sat in the July evening while Canada Day reassembled itself around them. Someone restarted the music. The fireworks over the river began again in earnest. The beers came out of the cooler. Denis's neighbour brought out a second round of food, and there was the ordinary business of plates and condiments and the persistent negotiation over whether the burgers were actually done. Across the yard, Fernan saw Bernard Cotet look up from his coleslaw. Their eyes found each other across the distance of a summer yard and 30 years, and the weight of a history that both of them had been carrying alone without knowing the other man was carrying the same weight. 3 houses away, Bernard raised his plastic fork. Fernand raised his empty coffee cup. What Suzanne did not know, and what she would not know until 6 weeks later, when a phone call came to her house in Dollard-des-Ormeaux from a researcher at the Canadian War Museum who had been contacted by a young man named Mathieu Tremblay, was that what had happened on Rue des Érables that afternoon was not finished. That the name Fernand Gagnon was about to travel in ways that the man himself would not have chosen and would not entirely stop, because some things, once said out loud after 30 years of silence, find their own momentum. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in late August, while Fernand was reading at his kitchen table in St. Lazare, and the garden was still, and the day had not yet announced what it intended to be. Suzanne called him immediately afterward. "Papa," she said. "Yes, there's a researcher. From the War Museum." A pause. "They want to do an oral history. They found something, a post, from someone who was at the party. Mathieu something. He wrote about what happened." Fernand was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the garden. "What did they find?" he asked. "Your name, the names you said, the 3 men." Her voice was careful. "Papa, Did you know there's almost no documented testimony from Strathcona's attached personnel during Medak? They said yours might be one of the last first-hand accounts. He sat with this for a while. I'll think about it, he said. He did the interview 9 weeks later at the War Museum in Ottawa, conducted by a historian named Dr. Patricia Lacasse, who had spent 14 years documenting Canadian peacekeeping operations in the former Yugoslavia. The interview lasted 5 hours, but she went very quiet, did not twice, in ways that were their own kind of response. She asked him about the northern flank. She asked him about the 31 hours. She asked him about the 3 men. He answered every question. The recording was added to the museum's oral history archive. A transcript was included in a research volume on Operation Harmony that was published the following year. In Jonquière, a man named François Desrosiers, who was 54 years old and had grown up with a framed photograph of his uncle Antoine on the living room wall and a family silence around it that had never been fully explained, read a transcript excerpt in an article shared in a veterans memorial group, and sat very still at his kitchen table for a long time before he called his mother. In Rimouski, a woman named Claire Tremblay, who was 81 years old and had kept a letter in a cedar box in her bedroom closet for 22 years, answered her granddaughter's call on the second ring and said, simply, "Yes." I always knew someone would say his name properly eventually. Bernard Cotte had his own conversation with his son that fall. His son Martin, who had grown up with a father who made coleslaw for neighbourhood parties and coached minor hockey and never talked about the 8 months he'd spent in Croatia in 1993, called one evening after seeing Matthew's post shared in a Canadian Forces veterans group online. "Dad," he said, "were you there at Dennis's party? Is this?" "I was there," Bernard said. A silence. "Why didn't you ever?" "I didn't know how to start," Bernard said, and then enough time passed that starting felt like an accusation. Like I was blaming everyone for not asking. He paused. That's not what it was. It was just a long time ago and the days were ordinary, and the ordinary days just kept coming. They don't have to keep coming the same way, Martin said. Bernard considered this. "No," he said. "I suppose they don't." Fernand Gagnon went back to his life in Saint-Lazare. He went to the Tuesday morning chess club at the community centre in Hudson, which he had attended for 8 years, and played a careful game against a retired engineer named Gilles, who had never beaten him and accepted this with equanimity. He called Suzanne on Sunday evenings. He tended his garden with the methodical attention he gave to all things that required it. He took out the photographs sometimes. 7 men standing outside a sandbagged position in flat grey Balkan light, their faces carrying the particular quality of faces that have recently looked at something they will be looking at in some form for the rest of their lives. He still didn't think of it as a sad photograph. He thought of it as a true photograph, which is different, which is harder in some ways and in other ways is the only thing that holds. There is a kind of service that gets monuments, that gets speeches and ceremonies and names carved into granite in city squares. And then there is the kind that Fernand Gagnon rendered in a specific region of Croatia in the fall of 1993, and again on a Tuesday in but outside Kingston, and again every time he took the photograph out and named the faces in it to himself without anyone else in the room. The kind that is not witnessed and not archived and not, for 30 years, spoken aloud at a summer party on the banks of the St. Lawrence. The kind that is simply carried day after day in the particular way that a man carries something when he has decided it is his to carry and does not expect to be relieved of it. He would have walked back to his chair by the dock, whether Bernard Cotte had appeared or not, whether Mathieu had searched his phone or not, whether any of it had gone anywhere or not. He had walked across Denis Fontaine's yard because it was the right thing to do, and he would have walked back in the same quiet he'd arrived in if the world had simply let him. That is what most of it looks like. Not the afternoon that someone finally witnesses. The 30 years of ordinary mornings before it, making coffee and reading the paper and carrying the names without fanfare, without asking the world to carry them too. Fernand Gagnon sat in his chair by the dock on the 1st of July, an empty Tim Hortons cup in his hand, watching the St. Lawrence move in its old indifferent way, and around him the river held everything it had always held, and he was enough, and he had always been enough, and he knew it without needing anyone else to say so. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that names like Antoine Desrosiers, Jean-Michel Tremblay, and Medak Pocket deserve to be said out loud, subscribe to Echoes of Courage. We tell these stories every week because they deserve to be told and because the people who carried them deserve more than silence. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. For Fernand, for Bernard, for every man and woman who carried something real and asked for nothing in return.